It's a fun idea. The thought of a president, a leader of a nation, also being a person who could mix a drink for you. It humanizes them, it makes them seem more like us, and there's a story many people have heard. It says that Abraham Lincoln, yes, that Abraham Lincoln, was once a licensed bartender. It's one of those bits of history that sounds too good to be true. And sometimes those stories are not quite what they seem. But let's think about it. Lincoln came from very humble beginnings. He worked many different jobs in his youth. He split rails, he ran a ferry, he was a postmaster, he even worked as a surveyor. He did whatever he could to make a living. He was a self made man. He lived a rough and tumble life on the frontier. So, the idea of him working behind a bar, serving drinks, might not feel that far fetched. It fits the image of a man who knew hard work, a man who understood the common person. It fits the picture of someone who wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty, or in this case, perhaps his hands sticky. This story about Lincoln and bartending often pops up. It's repeated in books, it's mentioned online. People tell it at parties. It's a part of the Lincoln lore. And like many stories about famous people, it has some roots in truth. But those roots often twist and turn. They get tangled over time. The truth can get stretched. It can get simplified, it can get made more interesting. That's just how stories work. Especially when they are about someone as big as Abraham Lincoln. So let's dig a little into this. We need to look at what bartending meant back then. It wasn't like it is today. Today, bartending is often a skilled job. People learn to mix fancy cocktails, they have special training, they work in dedicated bars. But in Lincoln's time, things were different. Alcohol was sold in many places. It was sold in general stores. It was sold in inns. It was sold by grocers. It was a common part of commerce. People drank more. It was a part of daily life for many. It was not seen in the same way we see it today. This common story connects Lincoln to a specific business venture. It happened when he was a young man. He was trying to find his way in the world. He was in a small town called New Salem, Illinois. This was a long time before he became president. This was before he became a lawyer. This was before he became famous. He was just a young man trying to make a living. And, like many young men, he tried different things. He looked for opportunities. He explored what he could do to support himself. And one of those things was opening a store. He went into business with a friend. His friend's name was William F. Barry. They opened a general store together. It was called Barry and Lincoln. This store was like many stores of its time. It sold a variety of goods. It sold food, it sold tools, it sold clothing, it sold whatever people in a small frontier town might need. And yes, it also sold alcohol. That was a common practice. It was a way to make money. It was expected. So, the story of Lincoln as a licensed bartender, it really comes from this New Salem store. People hear that the store sold spirits. They hear that Lincoln owned the store. And then they connect the dots. They imagine him behind a counter. They picture him pouring whiskey. They think he must have been a bartender. And they also hear about a license. This license is key to the story. But what kind of license was it? That's where things get interesting. That's where the facts start to diverge from the legend. We need to look closer at what that license actually meant in that time and place. It wasn't quite what most people imagine today. The legend of Abraham Lincoln as a licensed bartender often centers on his time in New Salem, Illinois. This was back in the 1830s. Lincoln was still a young man in his early 20s. He was trying to figure things out. He wasn't yet the towering figure we know from history books. He was just a guy. He had a lot of ambition, but he hadn't found his true calling yet. He was working different jobs, he was meeting people, he was learning. One of his ventures was going into business with William F. Barry. They opened a general store. It was called Barry and Lincoln. This store sold all sorts of items. It was a typical frontier store. You could buy flour there, you could buy salt, you could buy cloth. And yes, you could also buy alcohol. This was not unusual. Many general stores at the time sold spirits. Alcohol was a common commodity. It was part of daily life for many people. It was a source of revenue for businesses. Now, about that license. This is where the story gets its specific twist. It is true that the Barry and Lincoln store had a license, but it wasn't a bartender's license in the modern sense. Such a thing didn't really exist. What they had was a license to sell spirits. It was a business license. It allowed them to legally sell alcoholic beverages. This was a common requirement for any establishment selling alcohol. It was like getting a permit to sell any regulated product today. So, the license was for the establishment, not for Lincoln personally as a bartender. Think of it this way, if a grocery store today sells beer and wine, the store needs a liquor license. But that doesn't mean the grocery store owner or every cashier is a licensed bartender. They are licensed to sell alcohol, but they aren't mixing drinks behind a bar. They are just selling bottles or cans. It was much the same for Lincoln's store. They were licensed to sell, not necessarily to pour individual drinks for immediate consumption in the way a modern bar operates. The store, like many general stores, might have offered alcohol by the drink, but that doesn't mean Lincoln was standing there, wiping down a bar, taking orders, and mixing drinks all day. He was a co-owner of a general store. His duties would have involved selling all sorts of goods. He would have handled inventory. He would have managed accounts. He would have served customers whatever they needed. Sometimes that would have been a bottle of whiskey. Sometimes it would have been a pound of nails. And there's another detail about the Barry and Lincoln store. It didn't last very long. It wasn't a huge success. The partnership struggled financially. They accumulated a lot of debt. This debt would haunt Lincoln for years. He called it the national debt. It was a significant burden for him. So, the store itself was not a highlight of his business career. It was more of a learning experience, and a tough one at that. So, while the store did sell alcohol, and it did have a license to do so, it's a bit of a jump to say Lincoln was a licensed bartender. He was a co-owner of a general store that sold alcohol. That's a very different thing. It's important to be precise with history. The distinction might seem small, but it matters. It helps us understand the past accurately. It helps us understand Lincoln's life more clearly. The myth, however, sticks around. It's catchy. It makes for a good story. It paints a picture of a down-to-earth Lincoln. A man who truly came from the common people. A man who wasn't above any kind of honest work. And that image is very powerful. It's part of what makes Lincoln such an enduring figure in American history. But the reality is a little less dramatic and a little more practical. It was about running a business. It was about selling goods. It was about trying to make a living in a young, growing country. It wasn't about shaking cocktails or pulling pints. When we talk about Abraham Lincoln and alcohol, it gets even more interesting. Because despite owning a store that sold spirits, Lincoln himself was not much of a drinker. In fact, he was pretty famously abstemious. That means he avoided alcohol, or at least he drank very little. This is a well-documented part of his character. It's a contrast to many people in his time. And it certainly contrasts with the image of a busy bartender. Lincoln grew up in a culture where alcohol was common. Whiskey was a staple drink. It was often cheaper than coffee or tea. It was thought to have medicinal properties. People drank it at social gatherings. They drank it at work. It was everywhere. But Lincoln largely stayed away from it. He saw the problems it could cause. He saw the poverty. He saw the violence. He saw the broken families that alcohol often brought. He wasn't just someone who avoided drinking. He was also a strong supporter of the temperance movement. The temperance movement was a social movement. It aimed to reduce or stop the consumption of alcohol. It grew quite strong in the 19th century. Lincoln gave speeches about temperance. He talked about its importance. He believed it could improve society. He believed it could help people live better lives. In 1842, for example, Lincoln gave a famous temperance speech. He spoke about the evils of alcohol. He praised those who chose to abstain. He argued for the moral superiority of sobriety. This speech was serious. It showed his deep conviction on the matter. It's hard to imagine a person who gave such a speech then turning around to be a bartender. It doesn't quite fit the picture. Some historians say Lincoln rarely, if ever, drank. Others say he might have had a glass of wine on a very rare occasion, but no one suggests he regularly consumed alcohol. He certainly wasn't known for enjoying a drink. This personal stance is important. It highlights the difference between his business dealings and his personal convictions. He might have sold alcohol because it was a product people wanted. It was a product that brought in money. But he did not partake in it himself. This is a common thing in business. People sell products they don't personally use or endorse. A car salesman might not drive the brand he sells. A store owner might sell food he doesn't eat. It's just business. So, Lincoln selling alcohol in his store doesn't mean he was a drinker. It just means he was trying to run a successful business in his time. But the myth of him as a bartender, it conjures an image. It's an image of him pouring drinks. An image of him perhaps sharing a drink with customers. An image that feels very different from a temperance advocate. It shows how stories can sometimes ignore the full picture. Or they can focus on one small detail and blow it up. They can miss the nuances of a person's life. So while he was involved in selling alcohol, his personal relationship with it was distant. He kept his distance from the bottle. He preached against its dangers. This makes the licensed bartender label even more of a stretch. It's not just about the type of license, it's also about the person himself. Lincoln was a man of principle. And one of those principles for him was temperance. He believed in it strongly. This belief shaped his public life and his private habits. It's a key part of understanding who he was as a person. It certainly wasn't the kind of background you'd expect for someone who was a professional bartender. To truly understand the licensed bartender story, we have to look at what bartending even meant back in the 19th century. It was not a specialized profession like it is today. Today, you think of a bar. You think of someone behind a long counter, they are mixing drinks, they are talking to customers. They have specific skills. They often work only with drinks, but that was not the case for most of Lincoln's life. In the early 1800s, alcohol was sold in many different types of establishments. It was sold in taverns. It was sold in inns. It was sold in general stores. It was sold by grocers. It was just another commodity. If you owned a general store, you sold a little bit of everything. This included cloth. This included tools, this included food, and it included spirits. You didn't need a special title. You didn't need a special uniform. You just sold what people wanted to buy. The person who sold you a drink in a tavern might also be the innkeeper. They might also be the cook. They might also be the person who took care of the horses. It was a multitasking role. There wasn't a distinct bartender job category with its own set of professional standards. It was part of running a business. It was part of being a shopkeeper. So when the Barry and Lincoln store sold alcohol, it was just part of their general store operations. Lincoln, as a co-owner, would have been involved in all aspects of the store. He would have handled sales. He would have managed inventory. He would have done whatever was needed. If a customer wanted a bottle of whiskey, he would have sold it to them. This is not the same as being a dedicated bartender. The idea of a licensed bartender is really anachronistic for that time. Anachronistic means it's something from a different time period. It doesn't quite fit. There were licenses for establishments to sell alcohol. We talked about that. But there wasn't a personal license that someone got to prove they were a professional at pouring drink. That's a modern concept. It's a concept that came much later. People who ran taverns or inns might have poured drinks. They might have served alcohol to people, but they were seen as innkeepers or tavern owners, not as bartenders. It was part of their broader role. They offered food, they offered lodging, they offered a place to gather, and yes, they offered drinks. It was all part of the same business. Right? Even if Lincoln did pour a drink or two for a customer at the Barry and Lincoln store, it would have been just one small part of his daily tasks. It would have been no different from weighing out a bag of flour or cutting a length of fabric. It was just part of the job of running a general store. It was not a specialized skill or a dedicated profession for him. He was a merchant, he was a shopkeeper, he was trying to make a living. The legal landscape around alcohol was also different. Regulations were in their early stages. Licensing was often about collecting taxes. It was about controlling who could sell. It wasn't about the specific skills of the person serving the alcohol. It was about the establishment having the right to do so. It was about order and revenue. So if we imagine Lincoln as a licensed bartender, we're likely imposing our modern understanding onto the past. We're picturing him in a setting that didn't quite exist. We're giving him a role that wasn't really a standalone profession then. The reality was much simpler. He was a young man in business. He was selling things. Some of those things happened to be alcoholic beverages. It was part of the common commerce of his era. It wasn't a distinct career path. It wasn't a specialized skill he was known for. It was just one small detail in a much bigger, more varied life. So why does this story, this idea of Abraham Lincoln as a licensed bartender, stick around? Why do people keep telling it? It's not strictly true, as we've seen, but it has a certain appeal. It says something about how we want to view our heroes. It says something about how we remember the past. First, it humanizes Lincoln. He is a giant figure in American history. He is often seen as almost mythological. He saved the Union. He freed the slaves. He was a great orator. He faced immense challenges. This can make him seem distant. It can make him seem untouchable. But the idea of him working a common job, like a bartender, brings him down to earth. It makes him relatable. It makes him one of us. It makes him feel like someone you could have a conversation with. Someone you could meet in a small town. Second, it fits his man of the people image. Lincoln famously came from humble roots. He was born in a log cabin. He taught himself to read. He worked hard for everything he achieved. The story of him being a bartender reinforces this image. It shows he wasn't afraid of honest labor. It shows he understood the struggles of everyday people. It fits the narrative of a leader who emerged from the common ranks, a leader who understood the lives of ordinary Americans. Third, it's just a good story. It has a surprising element, it's unexpected. You wouldn't think of a president, especially Abraham Lincoln, doing such a thing. That unexpectedness makes it memorable. It's a little nugget of information that people enjoy sharing. It's a piece of trivia that makes history feel more exciting. Facts that are a little quirky tend to stick. But the real Lincoln, the one who navigated his New Salem store venture, was more complex. He was a struggling businessman. He was a young man trying to figure things out. He accumulated debt. He was involved in a partnership that didn't go well. He was also a man who believed deeply in temperance. He saw the harm that alcohol could do. These are all important details. They paint a fuller picture of the man. The myth simplifies things. It takes a small historical detail that his general store sold alcohol and had a license to do so, and it twists it into something more dramatic. It creates an image that isn't quite accurate. It ignores his personal views on alcohol. It ignores the actual nature of businesses in his era, but it does so in a way that serves a purpose. It tells a story that people want to hear. So, was Abraham Lincoln a licensed bartender? No, not in the way we understand it today. He was a co-owner of a general store that sold spirits. The store had a license to sell those spirits, but he was not a professional bartender. He was not pouring drinks as his main job, and he was certainly not someone who regularly drank alcohol himself. His life was a testament to hard work, self-education, and strong moral convictions, including temperance. The story serves as a reminder. It shows how history can get warped. It shows how legends grow. It shows how we want our heroes to be. Sometimes the truth is a little less exciting. But it's always more interesting, because the truth tells us more about the past. And it tells us more about the person. Lincoln's real story, the one about his struggles, his beliefs, his diverse early jobs, that is compelling enough. It doesn't need a fancy title or a misremembered occupation to make him extraordinary. He was extraordinary because of who he was, not because of a job he didn't truly hold.